introduce Kim Sterelny. Kim arrives almost directly from Australia. He arrived yesterday. You will immediately identify that Kim is Australian by his accent, and it's really a pleasure to welcome Kim. He did more than 36 hours of flight to get here, at least of travel to get here. We are extremely grateful. Kim is a professor of philosophy at the Australian National University in Canberra. He's a central figure in philosophy of biology, philosophy of science more generally. Kim actually studied with philosophy of language, then did some philosophy of mind, philosophy of biology, philosophy of general science. He did a very good textbook with his former PhD student, Paul Griffiths, who visited us last year. And the textbook is very nicely entitled Sex and Death, and it was published in 1999, and it's still one of the main textbooks in philosophy of biology. In addition to that, Kim is the author of many papers and also many books, at least 10 or 9, something like that. The two most famous books, I think, are the one published in 2003, which is called Thought in a Hostile World, The Evolution of Human Cognition, which won the Lakatos Award, and in 2012, The Evolved Apprentice, How Evolution Made Humans Unique. And this was a book which followed the Jean-Nicot Prize, so the prize which is awarded in Paris every year, I think. It is an extremely famous award internationally, even though the French used to ignore that prize or that award, just because the Institut Jean-Nicot is sometimes weirdly seen from a French point of view. But I can tell you this is a very, very good award that was given to many excellent people, including Kim. In addition to what I already said, Kim was the editor of Biology and Philosophy, the main journal in philosophy of biology, for I think 17 years, from 2000 to 2017, when Michael Weisberg became the editor of the journal. And Kim was really devoted to that task, really paying attention to every paper submitted to Biology and Philosophy. So I think the community is also grateful for that. Kim works mainly now on issues connected with human evolution, and different aspects of that can be archaeology, anthropology, many different aspects connected to human evolution. And today, Kim is going to talk about demography and cultural complexity. Thank you very much, Kim.
Thanks, Thomas. Whether you're grateful after the talk, remains to be seen. Okay, so until fairly recently, there's a sort of standard idea about how one tried to explain changes in the complexity of hominin life over deep time. Mostly, changes in technical complexity, just because of the absence of preservation, mean that we have more direct evidence about the toolkits of our ancestors than their social organisation. But in respect to both their technical skills and their social skills, the idea was that over the long duration of deep time, upward shifts in complexity, one does see evidence of upward shifts in complexity, were evidences of upward shifts in the individual cognitive capacity of the agents in question. So the transition from the very simplest stone tools, essentially, sharp flakes made by, hammering appropriate stone, to say the teardrop-shaped, the Schuldian hand axes, the sort of absolutely cliche signature stone tool that everyone recognises as a stone tool, is a signal of increased individual capacity. No one denied, at least not explicitly, that particular environmental and ecological circumstances might play a role, both in social organisation and in the appropriate toolkit. But the thought was that over deep time and over wide geographical areas, differences like that average out. So if you see, a clear upward shift at some stage in either the sort of social footprint, that humans leave, expansions in range size, for example, psychological zones or in their technical capacities, that signals an upward shift in individual cognitive capacity. And that explanatory strategy is still alive and well. So Robin Dunbar, for 15 or 20 years, with various co-authors, has been pushing a version of the social brain hypothesis in which he ties the social complexity of human life, in particular the kinds of social networks that hominins are capable of forming and using, to their relative neocortical capacity. So, he thinks, he has, both direct archaeological evidence, and evidence from comparative studies of primates, that social networks are constrained by relative neocortical size. So over the encephalization, of the hominin lineage, he thinks you see increases in both the size and the complexity of hominin social organisation. Likewise, again, for more than, for 20 years or so, the collaboration of Thomas Wynne, an archaeologist, and Coolidge, cognitive psychologist, have been arguing for what they call working memory hypothesis. The idea that increases in technical capacity, and they're mostly focused on tool use, are signals of increases in what they call working memory, what other people call executive function. And so the idea, that over large spatial and temporal scales, increases in complexity, signals of increases in cognitive capacity, is still well and truly with us. Despite that, though, in the last 15 or 20 years or so, really the last 15 years, the explanatory landscape has become significantly murkier and more complex, because a different idea, whether or not it's competing or complementary is part of the issue, has entered the sort of arena. And the idea that changes in complexity are driven by changes in individual capacity are under serious empirical and theoretical challenge. Let me briefly sketch the empirical challenge to start off with, and then the theoretical challenge. And the talk is essentially going to be about how to evaluate, this theoretical challenge. Now, the empirical challenge is that there just seems to be a disconnect between, the feature of human culture that we have the best evidence of, which is technical capacity, and morphological evolution in the hominin lineage, including especially encephalization, expansion in relative brain cells. There doesn't seem to be archaeological evidence of anything like a tight coupling between changes in hominin brain size and changes in technology. What you see are times, where technology changes, and about 150,000 years or so ago, starting to change, with a certain degree of drama and rapidity, without there being anything like a significant change in hominin brain size, and over, a long stretch of the Pleistocene. Encephalization seemed to be taking place without any signs of significant changes in technical capacity. And that's not what you'd expect if, the idea that technical capacity, is driven by individual cognitive capacity. So, as I briefly mentioned, in the late Pleistocene, in the last 150,000 years or so, there's a rapid, increase in the rate of innovation and diversification, with at most a little encephalization. There's some debate about whether there's any real encephalization, because there are changes in body size that are hard, that are hard to sort of distinguish from changes in relative brain size. And to take an example that I'm going to be mostly using, but not exclusively using in this talk, the Acheulean. The Acheulean is the period of the manufacture, and use of hand axes and similar large cutting tools. As I say, the one stone tool that everyone recognises. The Acheulean entered the archaeological record about 1.7 million years ago, and it was the dominant form of technology, together with the more ancient, sharp plate technology. For about 300,000 years, it was almost cosmopolitan in its extent. There was a time in which it was supposed that the Acheulean didn't really get used by those humans, in Far East Asia and in island Southeast Asia, but that's now been discovered that they did, though less frequently. Now, there's a certain degree of controversy about how much internal change there was in the Acheulean. The very pretty, beautifully designed, nicely symmetrical hand axes are mostly more recent rather than more ancient. But there's relatively little controversy that, between about 1.7 million years ago and about 800,000 years ago, there was next to no sort of progressive improvement, in that technology. The Acheulean, large cutting tools that were made about 800,000 years ago weren't, discriminably different from those that you see, much earlier in the stone tool record. So there's not much going on technologically here, despite the fact that morphologically there seemed to be quite a lot going on, in human evolution. So it's true that the introduction of the Acheulean is more or less coincident, with the emergence of Homo erectus, but only more or less, coinciding. But there's a good deal of encephalization in this 800,000 year period, with apparently nothing much going on in human technical capacity. So Acheulean tools, supplemented only by the fakes and cobbles of the even older technology, were used by human species whose brain size overlapped the modern range. So 800,000 years ago, Homo heidelbergensis, was emerging, and while on average Homo heidelbergensis had significantly smaller brain sizes than the sapiens average, and very significantly larger than the erectus average, the spread of variation of heidelbergensis overlaps the spread of variation of modern humans. So that's puzzling on this picture, this older picture and still prevalent picture, that the complexity of technology and social organisation is constrained by individual cognitive capacity, so that as individual cognitive capacity improves, technology becomes more complex. And that is one of the factors that's led to an alternative suggestion about what explains stasis and change, both in technology and social organisation. And that alternative suggestion, probably best thought of as a supplementary idea rather than a replacement idea. I don't think there's anyone who would want to say, that changes in individual human capacity have nothing to do, with changes in technology and social organisation. But the idea is that the cumulative technological evolution that we begin to see, kicking in about 800,000 years ago and accelerating from about 150,000 years ago, has preconditions in human demography and social organisation, not just individual cognitive preconditions. And that brings into focus what's going to be the main issue in this talk. Because the demographic hypothesis mostly derives not directly from evidence, but from a set of formal models of human evolution, in particular of human cultural evolution. And so it raises a familiar methodological issue. How do we evaluate the explanatory power and evidential support of models of human evolution, given that such models, like all models, always dramatically oversimplify the actual situation, that we need, explained, and hence there's always this issue of how do you evaluate the explanatory power and evidential support of models given their admitted simplification. That's a general problem in philosophy of biology, and in particular philosophy of evolutionary biology. It raised, for example, by Brian Skirm's well-known models of the evolution, communication and cooperation. As with the models of cultural evolution I'm talking about, they're clearly idealised, simplified in various ways, yet nonetheless are intriguing and important. So what I'm going to be talking about are these demographic models. And that's the main focus of the talk. Let me start to unpack it. Okay. So here's the demographic hypothesis in its barest and most general form. The take-home message of the talk, to prefigure what comes right at the end, is that there isn't a single demographic hypothesis. I think there are three distinguishable demographic hypotheses which have different degrees of support. I think two are very plausible, indeed extremely well evidenced. The third, which is by far and away the most attention, in fact, is the least well empirically and theoretically supported, in my view. Okay, so here's the idea. Complex technologies depend on cumulative cultural learning. In this arena, that's a more or less uncontroversial premise. Here's the critical premise, the idea that cumulative cultural learning is more efficient in larger, social worlds. And hence, the long sleep of the Acheulean, the lack of change between 1.7 million years ago and 800,000 years ago, was the result of life in micro-worlds, where cumulative cultural learning either doesn't happen at all or is so inefficient that it's very difficult for innovations to establish and spread. Waking up, the signs of innovation that we begin to see at 800,000 years ago, see a bit more around 500,000 years ago, and then taking off increasingly strongly from 300,000 years ago, was the result of increasing demographic expansion, and with it the greater efficiency of social learning, whether or not there was any increase in individual capacity. Maybe there were increases in individual competence as well, but the idea is that the change of pace of innovation that's seen in the human record from 800,000 years ago doesn't require increases in individual capacity. It can be explained by the increased efficiency of cumulative cultural learning, even if there is no increase in individual capacity. Obviously, that's the controversial element. Now, that controversial claim, has been defended, as I say, by a series of formal models, somewhat loosely linked to suggestive archaeological and ethnographic evidence. And I'll talk about the looseness of those links as we go on. There's lots of controversy about the plausibility of the models, what counts as relevant evidence, and specific evidential claims. I won't go through all of these controversies, but you'll get a slice of them today. Of the models, I'm just going to discuss one in some detail. The most famous one by Joe Henrich, developed in 2004, which is a sophistication of an earlier one by Stephen Shannon. There's another very important set of models that date from 2009 by Shannon and Powell, and those have been elaborated somewhat. But I'm going to walk through the Henrich model to explain the key ideas to you, and this is going to be the focus of the critical discussion. And as I've already said, the take-home message, is that the demographic hypothesis is in fact three hypotheses, and I think only one of those is genuinely controversial, and that's the Henry Powell Shannon version. So here's the first of the hypotheses, and I don't think it is controversial. I think there is some persuasive ethnographic evidence that supports it, as well as good sort of theoretical reasoning. Larger social worlds have the advantages of redundancy. Important skills are less likely to be lost by demographic accident. And there's some nice examples from Henrik and various other people, especially drawn from island populations and far northern populations, of ethnically, known, small world societies that have lost skills as a result of accident and illness. If there's only 2 or 3 people, in a community of say 12 who know how to make a stable and watertight kayak, you only need those people to have an accident or to get pissed off with you and leave, and you lose a crucial survival skill. And that's in fact one of the examples. There is a known Inuit population that did seem to lose the ability to make kayaks, that way. And this is no surprise, because it's just a special case of a well-known theoretical result. Selection is more efficient in larger than smaller populations, because the smaller the population, the greater the influence of stochastic factors of any kind. And of course, the stochastic factor that matters here, is the undirected death of people with crucial bits of information in their head. So redundancy protects you against that. I don't think there's any reason to think that that's not both true and almost certainly has been important many times, over the depths of human history. Here's the second, hypothesis, somewhat less well supported, ethnographically, but I think well supported, theoretically, and that's that larger social worlds support more specialisation, and specialisation supports, complexity. Larger social worlds support, specialisation basically through market size effects. If you're in a community of, say, 12 to 15 adults, it's very unlikely that a community of that size can support someone who, say, specialises in making arrowheads, even if they're the best arrowhead maker in the group. If you're in a community of 100 or 200, it's much more likely, that the market size for arrowheads will be enough, to support someone who basically spends his or her time making arrowheads and gets his resources from others, by various forms of trade and reciprocation. So you get, increased levels of skill for specialists over generalists, because specialists can afford to invest the time improving their skills, and if there's a connection between skill and complexity, that will drive complexity. You support a broader range of skills and tools, so the overall technical capacity you expect to see in a community is greater if there's specialisation. And perhaps most importantly of all, it makes it worthwhile to invest in specialist tools. If you only go fishing, once a year, it's not going to be worth your while to invest time and effort in making fishing nets. Making fishing nets is a big ticket item in traditional societies. If you fish regularly, if fishing is one of your main activities, it will be worthwhile to invest in making specialist tools, and that too, will increase, both the peak complexity and the overall complexity of the toolkit, in the population. There is some trade-offs here. The more specialisation there is, the less redundancy there'll be. So there is some trade-off effects here. Nonetheless, I don't take this to be a seriously controversial idea. How important it's been, in human evolution is another question, because there's some evidence, some ethnographic evidence that most small-scale forager societies don't have much specialisation. So this probably became important relatively recently in human evolution. By relatively recently, I mean something like the last 20 to 25,000 years. here's the critical. Larger social worlds support more accurate transmission of skills from generation N to generation N+1, and that's supplemented by two ideas which are kind of critical to the overall theoretical program here. The more difficult the skill, the larger the effective group size. And there's a positive correlation between the complexity of technology and using and making and using that technology. Without this, there'll be no clear signature of increases and decreases in skill level, in the archaeological record. Nonetheless, I think these both do fall out in fairly natural ways from the model that Henrik and his various collaborators developed. So let me walk you through the model. I'm not going to walk you through it technically and mathematically. I'm going to walk you through it conceptually, because conceptually it makes a lot of sense. Indeed, I don't think there's any doubt that Henrik's identified a real mechanism. The issue is going to be how important has that mechanism been over deep time. Okay, so first premise in the Henrik argument. Each tool in the community repertoire depends on a base level of skill in its making and use. If a tool is made badly enough, it's not worth using. So a badly enough made hand axe is less useful than the simpler older one. It's heavy, it's cumbersome. If it doesn't offer you advantages of cutting power, you're better off using a small sharp plate, less cumbersome. They're quick and easy to make once you've got the knack. Whereas hand axes, it's a much more labour-intensive and slower process. So, unless you're making hand axes at some threshold level, there's no economic incentive to make them at all. I don't think there's anything problematic about that idea. Now, suppose each novice in the community learns each skill, Z, from someone I'll call Thag. Ask me why later if you want. The most expert exponent of that skill in the group. Henrik makes this assumption in his modelling to give the friendliest possible way of setting up the idea. The idea is going to be degradation of skill is a threat, even if we suppose that everyone in the incoming generation is learning from the best person in the previous generation. If they're learning from the worst person in the previous generation, obviously the degradation of the skill would happen even faster. So this is a conservative assumption from Henrik's point of view. Even so, Henrik says, there's going to be some noise in the transmission of skill. There's always error, or some chance of error. So even if people are learning from Thag, and even though Thag is the best, chances are there's going to be some loss of information in the flow from Thag to Thag students. So far, so good, I think. Now, here's a critical, extra idea. The error rate in learning from Thag isn't constant. The more difficult the skill, the greater the error rate. There'll be more to learn and it'll be harder to learn, because that's what it is for a skill to be more difficult. Again, surely that's very plausible indeed. If I teach my daughter something really easy, the error rate's likely to be quite small. If I teach her to play drafts, for example, drafts is hard to play well, it's easy to learn the rules. Different story with chess. She's more likely to get, say, the way the knight moves wrong, or not quite get the castling rule. So this looks plausible. So there's some tendency for skills to degrade, and the more difficult the skill, the stronger that tendency. Now, though, novices in the group will vary in their capacity to respond to their own errors and to the noise in the transmission channel. You know, to compensate for the fact when Fag is trying to explain something, he gets distracted or coughs, or someone gets in the way, or for their own error. So there'll be variation in the student's capacity to compensate and correct for the error. So there's some chance that some novice so despite noise in the process, there's some chance that some novice in the incoming generation will equal or exceed that skill level. Just as a matter of probability, the larger the group of the novices, the more likely it'll be that there are novices with that capacity can then become the fags of their generation. Thus, for each skill in Z in a community, there's going to be a threshold size above which we expect the skill to be stable or improve, below which we'll expect it to degrade over time. And the more difficult that skill, the higher the threshold number. So complex technologies which depend on difficult skills will be stable only in larger groups. How large those larger groups will be will then depend on kind of how the numbers we put into all of these variables. But the qualitative claim is surely plausible. That complex technologies are stable only in larger groups. Now, as I said, this depends on the idea that there's a connection between the amount of skill a tool needs for its making and use and the complexity of the technology. There are, of course, all sorts of problems about how you define complexity, and those get, that is raked over in this literature. I'm just going to set those aside, for the purposes of this talk. Okay, so why do people make composite tools? One of the big ideas in the literature is that composite tools tend to fail less. So if you're in a circumstance where you cannot afford your tool to fail, you'll invest in composite rather than simple technology. And the idea behind that is that composite tools have the advantages of redundancy. So a spear with several barbs can kill even if one of the barbs breaks off as you stab your target. So that's true with respect to some forms of composite technology. But often, composite tools are failure prone through interdependence. If any component fails, the whole system fails. So consider one of the most complex pieces of technology known from pre-industrial ethnography, an inward harpoon, which has a warhead, a foreshaft, a main shaft, a tether, plus complex bindings which attach all of those pieces together. If any of those components fail, the harpoon fails and the hunt fails. You harpoon a walrus, and if the tether that attaches your harpoon to you breaks, even if you kill the walrus, you don't get the walrus. Likewise, if the warhead breaks off, or the foreshaft splinters, or the main shaft cracks, all failures, any significant failure in any of those components, results in an overall failure. And that fact, when you've got those sorts of tools, that's what generates the positive relationship between tool complexity and skill. With harpoon-like systems, the failure rate of the system as a whole is a product of the failure rate of each component. So a failure rate which might be acceptable for a simple tool might well be too high for a simple component of a composite tool, especially as the cost of making composite tools is always high. So components have to be engineered with greater precision, greater reliability, greater care in simple tools, and very plausibly that requires more skill. Okay, I've spent quite a bit of time laying out the model, you know, because I think it's important for people to understand how it works. Now, I don't think there's any doubt, that the sort of core idea is right. There's no surprise, that social and collective learning is more effective if there are more talented teachers and or more talented students, and all else being equal, there'll be more talent in larger groups. I mean, in a sense, what Henrik has done is an elaborate defence of a obvious claim like that. However, as with all models, it makes a simplification. In this case, I think the simplification is really critical. It ignores compensation mechanisms. Novices can compensate for noisy information flows from experts in various ways. One way is by investing more heavily in individual learning, trial and error learning and practice. Learning how to make stuff from masters isn't pure social learning. It's a combination of information you get, from the previous generation, plus your own, practice and experience. So as the social learning becomes, less effective, you can invest more heavily in individual learning, in trial and error, and in relying, more heavily on one another. So if you didn't quite get it, when Thag was explaining how to make the glue that attached the warhead to the shaft, but the guy next to you or the girl next to you did, you can ask her, and vice versa. Thirdly, you can accept greater wastage costs en route to an acceptable finished product. So, one of the big ethnographic claims about all of this is that Henrik provides an explanation of why in the Tasmanian archaeological record, bone points disappear at a certain archaeological point in time. Now, suppose it is difficult to make bone points. Well, one way I can be less skilled than Thomas in making bone points, or say arrowheads, is suppose Thomas is successful 90% of the time in taking a piece of raw material and producing a good arrowhead for it, and I am only successful 70% of the time. I waste more stuff than Thomas because I'm less skilled than Thomas at making arrowheads. Nonetheless, I still produce arrowheads. It's just the production of arrowheads is longer and more expensive for me. So the right conclusion from these models is that in general, there may be some exceptions, but in general, what less efficient social learning in micro-worlds does is increase the cost of complex technology. It doesn't make those complex technologies impossible to keep. And so the Henrik mechanism is important only if those increased costs often prevented the expansion of technical repertoire in the past. And I'm going to suggest that the answer to that is they don't. What evidence we have suggests that this has not typically happened. Okay, here's one piece of evidence. We actually know a fair bit about the time budgets of historically known and more or less contemporary forager societies. And one of the things that comes out of that is that their time budgets are routinely stressed. Foragers, at least for many of the seasons in their year, often have plenty of time available for non-foraging tasks. They're materially poor, but time rich. And of course, in learning new technology, there's a good deal of flexibility in when costs of time and energy are paid. Moreover, there are actually well-known examples of really small forager groups, especially ones in the far north, with very complex technologies which seem to be stable. There is some survey data on this which attempts to give all of this quantitative spin, and I can talk about that in Q&A if people want me to. But the sort of bare line summary is the survey data is mixed, conflicting, and contested. There's one set of surveys, in Oceania, that does suggest a connection between group size and technical complexity. and other survey data from basically the high latitudes of America, which leads to the opposite conclusion. What about archaeology? Here too, there are problems. One, is a sort of really quite serious problem of bias in the record. Almost everything disappears over time. That effect is stronger the more rarely a tool is made and the longer ago it's made. Complex tools are more expensive to make, so all else equal, we would expect complex tools to be made less frequently than simple tools. So we should expect complex tools to be subject to undercounting. And that effect will be particularly strong if what we're looking at are small groups in the deep past. Even if they did make complex tools in the same proportion as larger groups, they made absolutely fewer, and so the repertoire of smaller groups, is liable to undercounting, increasingly with temporal distance. So if human groups in the deep past had typically been small, we're pretty likely to have undercounted their repertoire, especially with respect to complex tools. And that leads to the worry that we actually have to take quite seriously a caution here. That the long sleep of the early Acheulean and the fitful and unstable stirring after 800,000 years ago, and the late Pleistocene, these are all to some extent, perhaps completely, perhaps partially, mirages introduced by a Gappian bias record of ancient hominids. Now, there are some ways that one could try and guard against these biases, but they're not at all easy. So this is something, a caution that we have to bear in mind. It'll take about another 5 minutes, is that okay?
I don't have it.
On about 45 now, or a little less than 45.
So,
Okay. Further on, sort of trying to evaluate these models against archaeology. At one stage, the poster example of the demographic effect was Tasmania. Here was the argument in Henrik's original paper. Tasmania got cut off in the after the last glacial maximum as the ices melt, sea levels raised, and Tasmania was cut off from mainland Australia, and Tasmania had a depauperate, the Tasmanian Aborigines had a depauperate, technology as a result. This has turned out to be very contested empirically. It's not clear, that the Tasmanians, before, they were cut off from mainland Australia, did have a significantly, different technology. The later Tasmanians, and the basis of comparison, is challengeable. So the poster example, I can go into detail in Q&A if people like, but the poster example, has become a lot less clear, a lot more contested. What it looked to be a beautiful example, a beautiful natural experiment. What happens when you cut a population off, drastically reducing its size? What happens is a depauperate technology. Lovely, just what the model predicts, except it's now very unclear that actually happened. What about the other way? The Pleistocene Great Leap Forward, beginning about 150,000 years ago, is argued to be the result of the expansion, of demography, of better social networks and increased, social scale. The trouble is, it's very difficult to get clear evidence that there was indeed an increase in social scale, beginning about 150,000 years ago. It's very difficult indeed to estimate, the size of, skip that. It's very difficult indeed to estimate the size, of human populations in deep time, and that's largely, though not exclusively, because of the time averaging effect, of traces. So you discover a midden, a shellfish mound, say, to take a real example, in South Africa. You've got these big middens. Are these big middens the result of a lot of people intensively using, the resources of the sea? Or are they the result of much fewer people using those resources but accumulating them in over a lot longer period? Makes a big difference to your estimate if you think that those middens are the result of 1 or 2 seasons foraging, or 100 seasons foraging, or 1,000 seasons foraging. But those differences in time are usually finer, than the temporal resolution we have, in these records. Certainly temporal resolution 150,000 years ago. Moreover, even when they're available, population size estimates define populations in importantly different ways. So the defenders of the Powell, Adam Powell and Stephen Shannon, in their 2009 paper, try and estimate the population sizes of Pleistocene South African populations from genetic evidence of their supposed, descendant populations. You can sometimes, use, descendant populations to give you an estimate, of population sizes in the past, because different historical population sizes will lead to different predictions about the kind of genetic variation you find in existing populations. However, there you're looking at a population in which genes flow relatively readily. And that doesn't necessarily correspond to populations in which information flows, social information flows relatively readily. Similarly, if you're defining populations that are connected by shared technology, economic practices and material symbols, and that's usually the way that the so-called cultures are defined in the Upper Paleolithic. So when you talk about the Aurignacian cultures, and so on in Europe, those cultures, those populations are identified as the same because of shared technology, shared practices, shared material symbols. What you're actually identifying there are the geographic spread and temporal depth of something that roughly corresponds to an ethno-linguistic group. That's very different from a population that's densely connected by daily interaction. And that matters, because if you're looking at the kind of redundancy effects, the effects which make cultural selection more or less effective, ethno-linguistic groups are probably the right scale for looking at effects like that. Because ethno-linguistic groups are connected enough, so that if you lose the capacity to make kayaks, probably, at least within a generation or two, you'll be able to borrow that capacity from others in your ethno-linguistic group. You don't need to be connected on a daily basis for information to flow over scales of 20 years or 30 years or 50 years. It's probably the right scale for specialisation effects as well, at least if there's trade between residential groups. But residential groups are the right scale for the efficiency of social learning. If I'm learning from Thag, if I'm learning how to make arrows from Thag had better be regularly around, not someone I see every 3 or 5 years. So if you're looking at the mechanism that Henrik has in mind, the social scale that matters is the size of residential groups, not the size of ethno-linguistic groups. But it's ethno-linguistic groups whose size is measured by genetic effects. At best, it's ethno-linguistic groups whose size are measured by genetic effects. And I think there are reasons to doubt, whether residential groups' size has increased, over time, when humans have lived as mobile foragers. That size is pretty stable as a result of, ecological and economic reasons. I'll talk about those in Q&A if anyone wants me to. I think I'd better move on to the concluding slides. Okay, So here's what I reckon. I think it's very likely, that social scale, via both redundancy and specialisation, really has played an important role, in the evolution of human technical, competence, and probably in the spread of social innovations as well. And my guess is those factors really were central to the late Pleistocene acceleration of technical change, mediated by change in connectivity and the emergence of something like ethno-linguistic groups. There's not much evidence, though, that higher costs of social learning in micro-worlds has constrained the evolution of technical complexity in our lineage. So we've got a somewhat ironic situation. Two take-home messages. The idea that increases in social scale make greater social and technical complexity possible isn't a single idea. It's three distinct hypotheses, and somewhat weirdly, in my view, the least well supported is the most prominent in the literature, and that's the idea that links complexity to the greater efficiency of cultural learning in larger social worlds. I think it's probably true, but probably not important. Okay, that's it.
Thank you.
Sorry, I went a bit longer than I intended, but
I'm sure you're doing fine.
not catastrophically longer.
So, importantly, before we start the Q&As, tomorrow starts the Definitions of Humanity conference. I can circulate the program if you're interested. This is something we co-organize with Etienne and Bruno, who are in this room. In fact, they did much of the organization, so I can freely advertise this conference. I just circulate the program. Yes. Questions, objections, please.
Concerning the apparent enigma about big brain or not, and complicated culture or not, it is not only a question of size, as you of course know. The connectedness of the brain, the number of synapses, could well have changed in the course of the time span we were discussing. And my second question is, do you think that only in late Pleistocene ethno-linguistic groups came about? I think it is much more likely that they have been around all the time.
Okay. Of course, sort of changes in connectivity may well be really important, and I guess one of the sort of most important sort of messages we're getting, from sort of more recent neuroscience, is both evidence about the variation and plasticity, of connectedness. I mean, the trouble is just how to kind of relate that, to what we can actually find, in the fossil record, especially of earlier humans. There's a little bit of evidence from endocasts, about the actual organisation, of brain, but even that rests on assumptions that sort of brain areas which we now know play some role, important role in, say, language or executive function, played the same role, 1 million years ago or 3/4 of a million years ago. And as I say, the more we know about plasticity, the less safe assumptions like that are. So, yes, I agree, and indeed, those people who kind of think, that the Pleistocene explosion had nothing to do with demography was driven, by changes in individual capacity, rest on that kind of fact. They can say, look, and in a sense it's true. There could have been a really important change, in how the brain is organised, which wouldn't leave a trace in encephalization. And that's true, but it's kind of nothing much can do, to test, that. On the more challenging question is the ethno-linguistic question. First point I want to make is, I don't think it's either, ethno-linguistic, the groups there or not there is going to be a matter of degree. You know, I'm one of those people who think that something like language, you know, symbolic culture and so on are things that have emerged, you know, slowly, gradually and incrementally, so there's not going to be a sharp difference, you know, between, you know, there being ethno-linguistic groups and there not being ethno-linguistic groups, and I agree that something a bit more like ethno-linguistic groups than the great apes have, you know, is deep in time. You know, I've been persuaded by the, you know, by the work of Rob Layton, you know, in particular, who's written about, you know, what he calls it sort of deep evolution of kinship, you know, to sort of, that, you know, it's, you know, maybe something, the origins of that go back to something like Homo heidelbergensis 800,000 years or so ago. So, you know, when I say the, you know, linking it to the greater diversification and the acceleration of innovation 150,000 years ago, what I'm suggesting is that you're getting a richer and more modern version of ethno-linguistic groups at that time depth, rather than not claiming that there's nothing that looked remotely like it deeper in time. So maybe that pulls our positions a bit closer together.
In several things you're talking about, I was thinking about population genetics model. A skill could be a gene. So did you use population genetic as a way to model your question?
I haven't done this modelling myself,
Okay.
but the original model, which was Stephen Shannon's model in 2001, is in fact based on population genetics, and so Shannon's model was you know, definitely based on the population genetics model, that selection acts more efficiently in larger groups than smaller groups. You know,
I'm not sure of that. Doesn't it depend on the variability you have in the group? If the group is homogeneous, selection is not going to be useful.
Yes, it does. It does rest on the idea that there's you know, variation, but I think Shannon, you know, assumed, you know, that the noisiness of cultural, you know, evolution is going to generate variation. You know, so given that you've got a sort of an engine of variation, you know, then chance factors will be less important in larger groups than smaller groups. So the original model was based on population genetics. You know, that got re-engineered a bit, you know, by Henrik, and got re-engineered again, you know, in 2009, and some successive tweaks. But they all, you know, tunnel back, you know, to originally population genetics models.
Thanks. So two points. Well, first, obviously, who is Thag?
Sorry?
Who is Thag, or why is he named?
Oh, okay. Are you a Gary Larson fan?
No.
Okay, so Gary Larson is a famous American cartoonist, you know, who's notorious amongst sort of both philosophy of biology for his extremely entertaining depictions of life. And Thag was the fictional erectine in one of these cartoons who was stomped on. You know, so Thag came to an unpleasant end. You know, so yeah, so it's a Gary Larson reference.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll get too tangled to go into all the detail, but yes, it's a Gary Larson.
And the more serious question concerning the very last point. So one could say today we are living in the largest social world at its maximum so far, but the accuracy of transmission of skills could be called into question. I mean, we are also in the age of fake news and different social bubbles. So is it mostly the hypothesis free that the accuracy of transmission of skills from one generation to the next? It's really the transmission of skills and not more general cultural memes or whatever. It's just really the skills and the improvement. Or what's your point?
It was focused on skill transmission. Now, and one of the sort of issues in all of this, you know, and especially those who are critical of this whole, you know, sort of the whole approach that comes out of Henrik and his, you know, teachers Rob Wilson, not Rob Wilson, Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson, is, you know, whether or not this social learning, you know, they're assuming that social learning is guided by model choice, you know, and in particular by the expertise, you know, of the model. So one set of, you know, criticisms of this, you know, in the literature is that, you know, this, you know, assumes, you know, all sorts of things about how individuals choose who they learn from, and that those assumptions were unrealistic. And then there's sort of further iterations of the model, which are supposed to show that even if there's only a little bit of this kind of, you know, success biased, you know, model choice, that's sufficient for the kinds of mechanism, you know, that they have in mind. So there's a sort of big backwards and back to and fro, you know, between Henrik and his various collaborators and co-authors, you know, and some of his critics in archaeology about whether the assumptions that they're making about the kind of oblique social transmission are realistic, you know, in the kinds of social environments they have in mind. I've been persuaded by Henrik and his colleagues that they can weaken that assumption and still get the qualitative results out of the model, you know, in ways that make the assumption not nearly as tendentious looking as you might think. So yes, that's a critical assumption that they make. In my presentation, I presented that assumption in a really strong form, but in subsequent iterations of the formal models, you can weaken that assumption, not completely. You've still got to assume that there's some element of what they call success bias transmission for all of this formal work, you know, to go through. But I think they have enough ethnographic evidence that there's some element of success bias transmission in enough social contexts for that not to be a deeply problematic aspect of their approach. Thanks.
I have one question.
Sure.
So how do we know how complex it is to make complex tools? I mean, it strikes me in your examples that maybe it's more difficult to do a great biface. It's more difficult to do a very good stone than to do an axe. Maybe, I don't know. How do we know it's difficult to make these complex tools? It's perfectly possible that you don't need a long social learning to do a very pretty axe. So for example, you can imagine quick teaching, quick learning, or people moving around in different groups, you know, and spend 1 or 2 days somewhere and then move to another group, things like that. And maybe that's enough to understand how to make something that we call complex now, but maybe it's not that cognitively or technically complex to make them.
There's some experimental work on this. It's far from decisive, but there is some experimental work on it. In particular, a guy called Dietrich Stout and various of his collaborators, you know, have experiments where they try and teach people how to make Acheulean hand axes, you know, and it takes somewhere between 90 and 200 hours of real evening. Now, you know, to make this really convincing, you'd have to replicate this and you'd have to extend it to composite tools. You know, how long does it take to, you know, learn to make bindings? How long does it take to learn to make the right kinds of glues and stuff like that? There isn't control tests of that kind, but there is a sort of informal social movement called the primitive technology movement, you know, which publishes books and, you know, sort of magazines and has kind of camps where people can go and learn how to you know, do these sorts of things. And so this is semi-anecdotal evidence. You know, it's only semi-anecdotal evidence. You know, and basically, it takes sort of ordinary living Homo sapiens, you know, kind of years of practice to become good at making these, you know, say the arrowheads that you find, you know, in the relatively recent, you know, archaeological record. So there's some evidence that suggests that our intuitive judgments of what counts as complex does track things like difficulty. It's far from decisive evidence, you know, and ideally we would have a lot more, you know, evidence of this kind. The numbers are very small, you know, in these experiments because, you know, they take a long time to run, you know, and you need really dedicated people, and you know, both students and stuff like that. So they're hard experiments to do, you know, in the numbers and with the control, you know, that would give you, you know, sort of, you know, genuinely clean results. But insofar as there's this, you know, initial experimental and semi-anecdotal evidence, it does seem to suggest, you know, that we're tracking something real, you know, in these intuitive complex situations.
Other questions?
Beaten you all into submission.
Okay, then. So thank you very much, Kim.